August 1883, Custer County, Nebraska Territory. Jess Lorne found the man at 8 in the morning, face down in the grass. At the east fence line the man was breathing. His shirt was rigid with dried sweat. He had a railroad worker's hands and a broken rib on the left side, and no horse, no bedroll, nothing to explain what he was doing 2 miles from the nearest road in the middle of a drought. Jess went back to the house and told Ada. Ada looked at her well 20 feet down, dry now for 11 days. She looked at the trough, empty except for a mud line 2 inches above the bottom. She looked at the reserve barrel on the porch, 2/3 full. She had been buying water from Orville Mast at 4 cents a bucket. She had enough money for 10 more days of it. Jessie stood in the doorway. Ada took the bucket off the porch hook and walked east. She did not know the man's name. She did not know what he knew. She did not know that he had spent 20 years building railroad grades through the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska, and that in that time he had solved water problems on 47 different work camps in country that did not want to give it up. She knew only that he was on her land and breathing. Ada Lorne had been running this ranch alone for 16 months. She had solved most of what it asked of her. The well was not one of them. Elias Lorne died in March 1882. He had gone to Broken Bow in the second week of the month for medicine. Jess had fever, and the road had been closed for 9 days. Elias took the horse anyway. He came back with the medicine and a cough he hadn't had before. By the end of the month he was gone. Ada was 26. Jess was 13. The ranch was 160 acres on the Loup Fork bottomland in Custer County, a house, a barn, a hay shed, a hand-dug well 20 feet deep. Elias had dug it in 1879, going down himself with a short-handled pick, bucket by bucket, until water came. The well was one of the first things he had finished, and one of the last things he mentioned before he died. Ada kept it clean. She did not sell the ranch. She did not write to her family in Abilene. She kept 40 head of cattle, and mended what broke and repaired what rotted, and measured every board with the iron ruler her father had given her in Kansas, 18 inches long. One corner bent from a fall, every mark still exact. The summer of 1882 was dry but not impossible. The well held at 15 feet. The summer of 1883 was different. May brought no rain worth measuring. June brought heat that cracked the yard surface in long, irregular lines. The buffalo grass along the east fence went yellow in July, a month before it should have. Ada watched it and said nothing. The well went dry on the 14th of July. She sent Jess down with a lantern on a rope. In the morning he called up, "Mud." She had him go down again in the afternoon. He called up. Nothing. Orville Mast had the only other well in the valley. He had dug it over 3 summers 72 feet by hand through Custer County hardpan, which was a thing most men said couldn't be done. He was 55 and built like the work he'd spent his life doing. He owned 400 acres east of Ada's fence line and 200 head of cattle and a hand pump that could raise 40 gallons a minute. He told Ada he could sell her water at 4 cents a bucket. She said she understood. She did not say anything else. That evening she told Jess, "Eni, to keep the cattle through August, they needed 400 gallons a week. At 4 cents a bucket, that was more money than she had, and more than she could get." Jess sat at the table. He said nothing. He had his father's compass. In his closed fist, a 2-inch brass compass Elias had carried since before Jessie was born. Jess had taken it from the desk drawer the day of the funeral and put it in his pocket. He had not taken it out since. Ada looked at the compass in his hand. She did not tell him to put it away. Ada Lorne had carried 40 head of cattle through a Kansas drought and a Nebraska winter without asking anyone for anything. She had not asked for this either. Frank Aldous had simply fallen at her fence. He was face down in the grass at the east fence line when Jess found him. 2 days after the well went dry, Jess had gone out to check for breaks in the wire and nearly stepped on the man's hand. Ada came with the reserve bucket. She turned him over. He was breathing. His shirt was rigid with dried sweat. On his left side the ribs moved wrong. Ada pressed 2 fingers against them and felt it. He made a sound but did not open his eyes. They carried him in on the door off the hay shed. He was 56 with a railroad worker's hands and a build that hadn't come from ranching. His coat had a Burlington and Missouri stamp inside the left breast. Ada saw it when she cut the sleeve to check his arm. She did not mention it. For 3 days he slept more than he woke. Ada kept water beside the cot and changed the cloth on his ribs twice a day. Jess checked on him in the mornings without speaking. On the fourth day, the man said his name was Frank Aldous. Ada said her name and Jessie's. She did not ask what Frank Aldous had been doing on a Custer County fence line in July, with no horse and no bedroll. Frank did not explain. He drank 3 cups of water and ate the bread on the table and looked at the ceiling for a long time. "Which way does your wind run?" he said. Jess had the compass out before Frank finished the sentence. He set it on the table face up and turned it until the needle settled. He said nothing. He pointed at the northwest mark. Frank looked at the compass. Then he looked at Jess. Jess looked at the wall. "How far to your water?" Frank said. 20 feet, Ada said. "Dry. Under 20. Don't know." Frank nodded. He spent the next week on the cot, but he was watching. The window faced northwest, and he watched the grass in the yard the direction the stems leaned, the way hay dust came off the barn roof, the angle of the chimney smoke at different hours. He watched it without comment. In the second week, he walked to the barn door and stood there with one hand flat against his ribs. Ada watched him from the table through the window. He stood at the door for a long time. Then he came inside. "Paper," he said. Ada gave him the back of a flour sack. He drew with the head of a nail clean lines. No hesitation, a tower. 22 feet, labeled at the margin. A rotor circle, 6 feet diameter, 8 blades. A shaft dropping off the page. A cylinder at the bottom. 2.5-inch bore, 8-inch stroke. Numbers in the margins. 14 degrees, my arm, 25 miles power lock, a well casing dropping beneath the cylinder. Below it, 34 feet, expect 4 days. Water likely 54. He drew the pipe rising beside the rod. He wrote, 2-inch galvanized, 14 joints. Hemp every joint. He drew the pipe elbow at ground level and wrote, moss burlap, 3 layers tallow. He underlined it. He set the nail down and turned the flour sack toward Ada. Ada read it. She did not look at Frank while she read. "Why 14 degrees and not 16, she said. Frank was quiet for a moment. 16 generates too much torque in high wind, he said. The joint bolts work loose in the first hard storm. Ada looked at the drawing again. She turned it. She set the iron ruler along the edge of the tower line and measured the ratio. Cottonwood from the Loup Fork bank, she said. 4 posts, 10-inch diameter, enough for the cross pieces. How deep are the footings? 4 feet, stone at the bottom. Not clay. Ada set the ruler across the flour sack. Jess came in from the barn, looked at the drawing, looked at Frank, and sat at the far end of the table without speaking. 2 days later, Frank Aldous was gone. He left before first light. He took nothing he hadn't come with. He left the flour sack exactly where Ada had set it. Ada nailed it to a board beside the window. Frank Aldous set the flour sack on the table, turned it over and began to draw. The lines did not explain themselves. Ada did not ask them to. She read it every morning while she ate. They started on the footings the last week of July. Ada laid out the square with the iron ruler and a length of twine 8 feet on a side 4 holes, 2 feet by 2 feet, 4 feet deep. Jess dug. Ada squared each corner. When the holes were done, she measured the diagonals with the twine, 2 inches off. She had Jess widen 1 hole on the north side until the diagonals matched. Orville Mast rode by on the second day. He stopped at the fence and watched Ada measuring the string across the holes. "Building a root cellar," he said. "Tower," Ada said. Mast looked at the holes. He looked at the flour sack through the window. "Windmill won't do it," he said. "You need the well for that. Water table's 60 feet if it's anywhere." Ada measured her string. "Thank you, Orville." Mast watched for another moment. He rode east. They hauled cottonwood from the Loup Fork bank the following week, 4 logs. 10 inches through, 22 feet long, 2 miles, 2 logs at a time, 4 trips in 3 days. Ada notched the base of each post to seat in the stone footing and bound the top section with iron wire against splitting. They set the first post on a Monday. Jess held it plumb, while Ada filled the hole in 4-inch layers of packed clay, tamping each layer with the axe handle before adding the next. She checked plumb after every 2 layers. Noon, the post was true. All 4 posts were set by Wednesday. The cross pieces went in next cottonwood rounds 4 inches through, cut to 8 feet. 3 levels, 7 feet up, 14 feet up, 20 feet up. Ada marked each height with a rope she had knotted at the right length. She fastened every cross piece with 3/4-inch iron bolts. 2 per joint, through bolted with washers on both faces. The drawing had specified bolts and washers. She used bolts and washers. Jess asked once, why not nails? Nails don't hold rotation, Ada said. The wind will unscrew a nail. Jess did not ask again. The rotor blades came from pine boards, $2.40 from broken bough, hauled back in the wagon. Ada cut them to length, sanded both faces until they wouldn't splinter, and tin-faced each blade on one side with sheet metal cut to shape and fixed with copper tacks. 8 blades. She cut a wooden angle guide from the dimensions in the drawing 14 degrees and used it to set each blade on the hub before fixing it. She checked every blade against the guide before she moved to the next. Jess watched her check the second blade, then the third. What's the guide for? He said. Measure it or don't build it, Ada said. Jess took the guide and checked the fourth blade himself. The hub went on top of the tower. The tail vane, a flat board, 4 feet by 2 on an iron bracket, went behind the hub. Jess held the vane while Ada drove the bracket bolts. The tail vane would keep the rotor facing into the wind without any further attention. Then the well, the hand auger, came from a man named Fenwick in Broken Bow, borrowed against 3 days of hay hauling Ada had done the previous fall. An extension rod post-hole auger with 2 add-on sections and a spare cutting head. They worked the auger in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. The first 20 feet went quickly through the existing bore. Below 20 feet the clay was new and dense. The auger came up every 6 inches, loaded with pale gray material that smelled of deep earth. Jess scraped it clear with a stick. They lowered it again at 34 feet. The auger stopped turning. Jess brought it up and Ada looked at the cutting head. The clay had given way to a white-gray powder and chips fine. Dense, resistant, she pressed her thumb against a chip. It left no mark, she said. She looked at the flour sack on the board. 4 days, they changed to the steel-tipped head. The auger advanced in half-inch turns, sometimes quarter-inch. Ada's hands blistered the first afternoon. She wrapped them and kept turning. Jess counted revolutions under his breath. 4 inches the first day, 6 the second. On the third day, the bit caught a softer seam, and they made 14 inches by dark. On the fourth day, at noon, the auger dropped. Jess nearly fell into the hole. They stopped at 38 feet, and Ada pulled the auger. She lowered it again and brought it back, and the cutting head was wet. She sent Jess down with the lantern he called up. I can see it. It's shining. They bored to 58 feet and stopped. The pump cylinder went in first down on a rope set on a wooden ledge Ada had cut into the bore wall at 58 feet. 2.5-inch bore, 8-inch stroke, cast brass plunger valve. She had waited 2 weeks for it from Broken Bow. She lowered it slowly, guiding the rope hand over hand. It seated square. The sucker rod next 56 feet of 1-inch wrought iron in 14 4-foot sections, each joined by a hex bolt, through a flanged coupling. Ada and Jess assembled it section by section going down. Jess holding the assembled weight with both hands while Ada drove each coupling bolt. 14 joints, Ada said when they started. Wrap them all. She cut hemp fiber into 8-inch lengths and soaked them at each threaded joint. Before Jessie turned the sections together, Ada pressed wet hemp around the threads 2 turns, packed tight with the blunt end of a stick, and Jess drove the joint home while the hemp compressed into the gap. They reached the cylinder as the sun dropped behind the barn. The galvanized pipe went down beside the rod, 2-inch diameter, 14 4-foot sections, hemp wrapped at every joint. At the surface where the pipe elbowed out of the ground toward the trough, Ada wrapped the elbow. 4 inches of dried moss from the Loup Fork bank, 3 layers of burlap tied with baling wire. Rendered tallow heated until liquid and poured into the gaps with a ladle. She connected the rod top to the windmill crank. They waited. The next afternoon, a northwest breeze came up 12 miles an hour, by the feel of it on Ada's face. She released the lock pin on the rotor. The blades caught, the crank turned. The sucker rod began to move. Ada and Jessie stood at the trough and said nothing. 40 seconds. Then a sound deep in the pipe, something shifting below ground. A slow pulse, then the knock of the cylinder. Then the first water came over the pipe lip, a thin stream, pale with clay from the new bore. Jess turned and looked at Ada. Ada did not turn. She watched the stream. The pump had been running for 2 mornings. The output had been right for one of them. The second morning, Ada stood at the trough for an hour and counted. At 12 miles an hour, the output should have been 35 gallons or better. She counted the marks she had scratched into the trough wood at 1-gallon intervals. In an hour the trough had risen 8 marks. 8 gallons. She locked the rotor. She stood at the pipe and thought the cylinder was right. She could hear it from the ground. The rod was moving. The blade angle was correct. She had checked every blade with the guide. She went to the flour sack on the board. She read it twice. Her eye stopped on the margin note, 14 joints, hemp every joint. Ada unlocked the rotor and let the pump run. She put her hand flat against the pipe, at ground level, and pressed her fingers to the metal. Nothing. She moved to the first joint, above ground. Nothing. She moved to the second joint, and pressed her fingers against the coupling. A pulse. Small, irregular, not the pump's rhythm, something separate. She locked the rotor. "Jess," she said. He came out of the barn. "We have to pull the pipe." Jess looked at her. "All 14 sections," she said. "Do it right now or do it twice." They started pulling at noon. Rod first, then pipe, all 14 of each, laid out in order beside the well. Ada went through the pipe joints herself, running her fingers over the threads at each coupling. At joint 2 from the bottom, 50 feet down, the hemp was missing. The threads were bare. The joint had sealed against pressure at rest but not under load. Water had been slipping back down the threads whenever the pump cycled. Ada held the section for a moment, then she laid it with the rest. She and Jess rewrapped all 14 pipe joints, not only the one missed. All of them. 2 turns of wet hemp at each thread, packed tight. 3 hours. Ada checked each joint after Jess turned it home. When they were done, she said, "Count them." Jess counted to 14. 14 again. He counted again. They lowered everything and connected the crank. Ada released the lock. The rotor caught the wind at 11 miles an hour. Ada stood at the trough and counted. 20 minutes, 38 gallons. Jess stood beside her. He was holding the compass outside his pocket now, in his fist rather than in the pocket. Ada noticed he had been doing that since the 3rd day of the auger work. She said nothing. That same week, Jess noticed the rotor slowing at wind speeds that should have been sufficient. He waited until a clear night and checked the compass against the North Star. The needle showed 8 degrees of deviation. The compass had read consistently wrong. Since they set the tower direction in August, the windmill was 8 degrees off the true northwest bearing. In straight west wind it was fine. In the deep northwest wind of winter, the rotor was not meeting the wind square. Jess adjusted the tail vane by 8 degrees and didn't mention it. They fixed it in October. By November, the trough was full before 6 in the morning. January would be the question that the pump had to answer. The smoke from the chimney stopped rising on a Tuesday morning in January. Ada saw it at 5 in the morning while she was building the fire. The smoke came out of the pipe and lay flat, spreading east in a thin, continuous sheet. No lift. She watched it for a moment, then went back to the stove. By 7 the wind had shifted from west to northwest. It had a different sound than west wind, lower, without variation, continuous in a way that west wind wasn't. The fence wire did not whistle, it hummed. Ada went out to the barn. All 40 cattle had turned in their stalls, facing south without being moved. She came back inside, storm coming. She said, "When?" Jess said she thought about the smoke. Tonight Jess stood up and put his coat on. They spent the day on the ranch. Jess filled every barrel in the barn from the trough, 3 barrels to the rim, before the pump even needed to run at full output. Ada checked the rotor lock mechanism by hand. Tested it twice, confirmed it engaged cleanly. She checked the pipe elbow, the moss packed solid, the burlap tied tight, the tallow surface hard under her thumb. Jesse reinforced the hay-shed corner tie-downs that had worked loose in December. Ada checked the barn door top hinge and drove a new bolt through the bracket. By 3 in the afternoon, the northwest sky was white from horizon to overhead. At 5, the first snow came, not flakes but needles. Horizontal, striking the window glass with a sound like sand thrown against it. Ada lit both lanterns. At 6 the wind hit the north wall. The whole cabin shook. Then it hit again. Then it settled into a continuous pressure, a roar without variation, pressing the north and west walls simultaneously. Snow appeared on the inside of the windowsill as fine powder, driven through the frame gaps by air pressure alone. Jesse sat at the table. He had the compass in front of him, face up. He wasn't looking at it. He was listening to the barn. Ada kept the fire. By 8 the temperature had dropped below zero. She knew it from the sound the door made when she opened it a hand's width to check a high, tight creak the wood made only in deep cold. At 10 Jess said. Ada had been listening to the barn for an hour. The usual settling sounds, cattle shifting position, pressing together for heat. Now she heard something different. A series of low repetitive calls, close together. They hadn't watered since 4 in the afternoon. Ada put on her coat. Jessie stood up. I'll go, Ada said. The rotor lock. Jessie said. I should check it. The windmill was 20 feet northwest of the barn door. In this storm it was invisible. Ada looked at the compass on the table. She looked at Jess's face. She did not say no. Jess put on his second coat, over the first, and tied 60 feet of rope to the door bracket. And to his belt he held the compass face toward the lamp and read it. Northwest was 315 minus 8 degrees of compass deviation true, bearing 323. He had the correction in his head. He had been carrying it since October. 9 steps, Ada said. Count them. Jess opened the door. The wind hit him in the chest. He pulled the door shut and stood in the black. The snow was not falling. It was moving laterally, everywhere at once, and the cold was a physical pressure against his face. Against his eyes he held the compass against his chest to warm the glass, then read it in the dark, by feel alone. He turned until his body faced the corrected bearing. He walked. 1, 2, 3, the rope paid out behind him. 4, 5, he was pushed east, and he corrected. 2 degrees of lean into the wind. 6, 7, his nose was gone. He could not feel it. 8, his boot hit something solid, and he reached out with his right hand and found cottonwood, the post, the base of it, rough bark, in the dark. He put both hands on the post and felt upward until he found the lock bracket at 6 feet. He pressed his thumb into the mechanism. The pin was seated. The rotor was held. He stood still for a moment and felt the whole tower vibrate through his hands, not swaying, only conducting force. The bolts and crosspieces transmitting the wind down into the stone footings. The tower was not moving. Jess followed the rope back. Ada had the door open before he reached it. He came inside. He could not feel his hands for 2 minutes. Ada stood beside him, without speaking, while they came back. The cattle quieted after midnight, when Ada carried water from the reserve barrels by hand 6 trips. 2 buckets a trip, 12 gallons, enough. The barrels had 2 days of reserve remaining. On the 3rd day the wind dropped from 35 miles an hour to 20, then to 12 by dark. Ada released the rotor lock at 12 miles an hour. The pump ran. The trough filled in 4 hours. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. By noon the wind was 8 miles an hour from the northwest. Steady and cold. The pump ran at 35 gallons an hour. Ada walked to the east fence and looked across the flat toward Mast's property, a mile and 6/10 open ground. The snow broken only by the road ruts filling in. She could see smoke rising from his chimney. It went straight up. She looked at her pipe elbow. The moss and burlap were intact. No ice, no cracking, no failure in the surface. She went inside. The road did not open for 4 days. Orville Mast walked through the snow. On the 4th, the road was a guess, a low depression in the snow where the wagon ruts had been. Running east from Ada's gate, he was walking it without a horse. Ada saw him from the kitchen window at mid-morning, a dark shape, moving through the white. She waited. He came to the fence gate and stopped. His hands were in his coat pockets. He did not open the gate. He stood there. Ada put her coat on and went outside. He looked older than he had in the summer. The walk had cost him something. His coat was wrong for the cold, a working coat, canvas not wool, and his boots were dark to the ankle. Ada looked past him toward the windmill. The rotor was turning at 8 miles an hour. She could hear the low knock of the cylinder from where she stood. Mast looked at her. The pipe elbow, he said. It went in the freeze. Ada waited. Cattle been 3 days without. He said. She thought about the 4 days hauling cottonwood, the 4 days of caliche, the morning of the 8-gallon count, the night. Jess had walked 9 steps into nothing, with a compass he knew was wrong. The valve is on the south side of the tower, Ada said. I'll open it. She opened the gate. She walked to the south coupling without looking back at Mast and turned the valve. Water ran east through the extension pipe Ada had laid in November along the fence line. Mast watched it run. Jesse came out of the barn and stood at the fence. He had the compass in his hand, outside the pocket in his fist. He watched Mast, the way he watched everything. Without comment, without movement, Mast turned and looked at the tower. He looked at the crosspieces. the rotor, the tin-faced blades. He looked at the pipe elbow with its moss and burlap casing. "What ratio?" he said. "The hemp. 2 turns at each joint," Ada said. "Pack it wet before you thread." Mast nodded once. He stood there for another moment. Then he turned and walked east along the snow road. Ada stood at the tower. The rotor turned at 8 miles an hour, 38 gallons an hour, rising through the galvanized pipe and running east through the extension, and into a man's cattle tanks, a man who had charged her 4 cents a bucket. In August, she went inside. Jess stayed at the fence until Mast was gone. Then he came inside and sat at the table. He set the compass face up on the wood. He looked at it for a while. He took his father's penknife from his pocket and pressed the blade flat against the brass case, just below the 0 mark on the bezel. He drew one horizontal line, 3/8 of an inch. Not deep, just enough to cut the brass. Not a letter, not a word, just a line. He closed the knife and set the compass on the table. Ada looked at it from across the room. She did not ask what it was for.